Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and I sometimes wonder if, in a more profane world, Mozart's most famous piece should in fact be called The Magic Effing Lute. Goodness, what a cool start to the episode, but it does take us to the heart of the 18th century, because The Magic Flute was premiered in 1791, and today we're going to be talking about a show that's even older, and yet, like the works of Mozart, particularly things like The Marriage of Figaro, can at least claim to be one of the godfathers of modern musical theatre. And that's a piece of work called La Serva Padrona, or in English it's usually translated as The Maid Turned Mistress, which is a 1733 comic opera by Giovanni Pergolesi. And it may be that it's ringing a bell with you, because it is a show that I saw in Edinburgh in 2015 and enjoyed immensely. But I wasn't watching a representation of the original 1733 show. I was watching a brand new version where it had been updated into modern English with modern idioms and set in a British corporate boardroom. And so it had been renamed The Secretary Turned CEO. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. As a contemporary show, it was fantastic, and it's really nice to see people still using light opera and making it absolutely contemporary and 21st century, whilst at the same time being true to those 18th century roots. And the thing that makes this particularly good, and why I'm so pleased to be able to revisit this on Musical Talk, is because you can see it. It's technically part of our virtual Edinburgh Festival Fringe 2020, which, if you remember, is where we are looking at some of the shows which have been performed at Edinburgh over the last 20 or so years, and for which recordings have been placed on YouTube or other streaming video sites. So, if you want to see The Secretary Turned CEO, you can do so, and I'll be giving you details of where you can find it online at the end of this episode. But to take us there, we're going to start with a brand new review of the recording made by me and my good friend Colm Malloy. I saw the show in Edinburgh, he did not, he'd only been able to see the video, but we watched it together and then we reviewed it together, and we both really enjoyed it, in my case for a second time. And then we'll hear a short medley of some of the songs from that 2015 performance. And then finally, we'll hear an original interview I conducted with Danyal Dhondy, the musical director of that Edinburgh production of 2015, when he really explains how the show came to be and the history of it. And I hope reveals why I think it's such a wonderful modern show. Well, that's been rather a lot of nothing from me, so it means that without further ado, let's get into today's main conversations, which are all about The Secretary Turned CEO. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello again, Colm. It's always good to see you here on Musical Talk. Thank you for coming to talk to me today. And I'm going to start with a question.
Yes.
And it's not just how are you, although I am of course always interested. It's actually, what's your view on taking a historic piece and then reworking it in a contemporary form?
Well, I'm fine, thank you for asking. How are you?
I'm marvellous, thank you. I'm happier for hearing your answer.
Good. Yeah, I actually really like it when something is taken and reworked in that kind of sense. When you said that, it immediately made me think of Rent, obviously being based off La Boheme.
Of course, yes.
And actually, now I think about it, musical theatre owes a lot to previous inventions.
West Side Story!
Well, yeah, but not even just that, but The Lion King being based off Hamlet, and Oh,
all the others.
Yeah, well, all the other Shakespeares that have been turned into something. I think if it's done well, it's great, and I think if it tries not to carry its predecessors too heavily, equally great. And I like West Side Story for the most part, but I think Romeo and Juliet sneaks in there a bit too much towards the end. It doesn't have to follow the story to the letter, does it?
Well, there is a danger, isn't there, that actually, and I think you see this in Bear, for example, which owes a lot to Romeo and Juliet, and the problem is the moment you hear the words Romeo and Juliet, you know it's not going to end well. Now, would West Side Story be the show it is today if actually they were able to find some kind of entente at the end and come to terms?
Well, don't know, because they both don't die at the end, do they? Which I guess is a slight variation on the Romeo and Juliet story, in that they both die at the end of Romeo and Juliet, but not at the end of
only
West Side
one dies in West Side Story. I see the point.
So there's some sense of, glimmer of optimism.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think you're clutching into the darkness in hope rather than in anticipation. But the reason I ask this, of course, is because as part of our virtual Edinburgh Festival Fringe here on Musical Talk, you and I have sat down and watched a recording of a show which was up in Edinburgh about 6 years ago, 2013, 2014. And it was called The Secretary Turned CEO. But it's probably also better known for people who love opera, particularly comic opera, as The Servant Mistress. That's the English translation of the original in Italian, which I'm afraid I don't know, by Pergolesi. It was a 1733 opera buffa. I'm not pronouncing that properly, but that's the Italian term for comic opera.
Sure.
And it's not the same as opera bouffe, which is a French term for something similar, but there's lots and lots of gradations of opera and operetta and comic opera, and I'm not proposing to go into that here. But suffice to say, it's an early representation of good Italian one-act comic opera from 1733, which has well outlived the bigger opera in which it acted as a filler. It was an intermezzo, which you probably know is a show which is performed often by same members of the cast of a bigger opera during one of the many intervals in a bigger opera, as traditionally was the case. It's escaped its sort of moorings, if you like, and gone on to be a success, and has continued to be produced on and off since 1733. It was on Australian television with June Bronhill, I believe, in the 1960s. But it's been reworked, or it was reworked only a few years ago for the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. I saw it live in performance. I really, really enjoyed it. It was something very different from the standard musical fare at Edinburgh, and I loved it for that. But what it did was it took this story, it's a three-hander in the 1733, it's a three-hander here in the 21st century. It reworked it into an office environment rather than a home environment. In the original one, she is a shrewd, intelligent maid who's much cleverer than the ageing master of the house. So he has authority by being master of the house, but it's fading because he's an imbecile and he's old.
Sure.
Well, she runs the place, and they have this love-hate relationship, and there's a kind of third servant who is silent in the original in 1733 and is silent again essentially in the version we saw, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But it was reworked not only in context, but also the music was, as I understand it, sort of re-rhythmed and given a slightly 21st century lick of paint.
Yeah, I wouldn't say hugely.
No,
it's still identifiably
18th century.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was very, very modestly reinterpreted, which I liked. I liked being able to. I don't actually recall if I know the tunes very well, but I certainly recognised stuff when listening to it, which was nice. It wasn't as if it was completely bastardised and turned into some kind of what we might think of as 2010 to 2020 pop music.
Yeah,
it still felt like legit opera.
It's still an opera, not a rock opera. Yeah. I believe the instrumentation was changed.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yes, and it gives it a slightly funkier feel, and I believe there were some pacing and rhythm things.
Yes,
but essentially
around.
But I mean, that's its sort of historical context. Briefly, if you care to, just describe as best you can what we saw. There's always a danger, and we have to say this, that any recording of a live show misses the buzz of a live show, and you're always worried you're not able to quite see everything or feel everything. It's not the same experience, but given the world we're in 2020, this is the best we can do.
Yes.
And it was wonderful to see it again for me, but you were seeing it fresh.
Yes.
How did it come across?
Well, maybe you can help me, but from what I saw were in some kind of corporation that deals with loo roll.
Soft sheets, lavatory paper suppliers to the House of Lords and other illustrious clients.
Thank you. Though whether there was any kind of turmoil or crisis amongst the corporation, I'm not entirely sure. I think the point of the show is the dynamic between the secretary and the boss, as it were, she's trying to rise to the top or she's trying to defame herself to defame him.
That's how the plot develops.
That's what I mostly got out of it. The kind of details along the way, I'm not so sure, but there was some kind of deception or some kind of police thing that went on, and then our kind of silent character then assumes some kind of
disguise.
To what end, I'm not sure.
Well, the plot, as I understand it, because I think what you've actually inadvertently hit on there is a slight problem as well with opera in English. It's not always easy to understand precisely what's going on. You've got the gist of it.
Yes.
I mean, essentially the setup is exactly as I was talking about in the original 1733. You've got a boss who was the master of the house in the original and is the master of the company in this, so he's the CEO. It's a small company but just sells lavatory paper. She does all the work. He's a lazy soul. He doesn't really know what he's talking about, and that becomes more and more apparent. So exactly the same thing. All he's got is the authority of his position. He doesn't have any authority in that position. She is with the brains. She does all the sales. She keeps all the records. She is the thing that keeps it afloat. And the third silent character is referred to as experience boy, I think. He's a work experience, so he's presumably paid nothing and does nothing. I mean, he's just a kind of stooge for what when a third pair of hands is required. There's a sort of love-hate relationship once again between the secretary and the CEO, and they burn hot and cold with each other all the time. You know, one moment they declare their love for each other, and then the next moment they're infuriated by something. So it comes to a head when he sacks her because she asks for a raise, because she's, you know, the company relies on her. She asks for more money. He says, "How dare you, Serena? Get out." He's called Henry. She's called Serena. And so he feels himself full of bravado about how he's the only thing who's needed. He then sort of promotes the experienced boy who's rubbish, can't do anything. And then he realises that he actually can't do anything. By which time she's cooking up a plot. She feels very hard done by, quite understandably. So she pretends that she's made this terrible mistake in all the accounting. I mean, this is the first opera, I think, that mentions corporation tax, VAT, and income tax. So she says they've been found out by the customs and revenue people, and they're going to come for them, and there's a chance they'll both be going to prison. So he's thrown into a snit, shall we say. So she promises to take the blame. So she'll take the blame. So he suddenly feels very grateful to her, and this brings out his sort of fatherly feelings for her, or probably sexual feelings for her. But there's more to it than this. She brings in the silent character, the experienced boy. I think twice, isn't it? She gets handcuffed by him, so it looks like she's been arrested. So it makes it all urgent. And then he comes in again, this time dressed as, or disguised as, a solicitor who's going to find a loophole in the law. And the only loophole that can be found is if in order to help him, the manager, avoid blame, he has to sign the company over to her, which he then dutifully does. Then the disguise falls off, and we realise that he's not actually a solicitor after all, the experienced boy.
Well, we hear one of the kind of arias in mobile phone
human
form.
Well, that's how the disguise is blown, isn't it? Because his very distinctive mobile telephone call comes out from underwards, and the manager realises he's been conned. So by now she's had the company signed over to her, so she's got what she wants. This is the point he realises he's always been in love with her, and she's always been in love with him. This is where the comic opera comes in. The psychology here may not be absolutely accurate, and they forge a relationship, and they marry essentially. So they both become the CEOs of the company and live, we assume, happily ever after in a much more, one hopes, calm environment.
With a life supply of loo roll.
Yes, absolutely. I will say, in the original, it's much the same thing. There's quite a lot of original stuff kept in rather nicely. The original argument in the 1733 version is that the master is cross that his maid servant hasn't bought his morning hot drink. And with the version we saw today, would you care to describe what happened?
Well, it's done the same with instead the experienced boy. He's got his own coffee, hasn't he?
He doesn't like it. It's English. You hear him say in Italian, inglese coffee.
Thank you.
So he spits it back in the cup.
And spills the CEO's coffee.
In the act of drinking it?
Yes. Yeah. Clears it up. And obviously this coffee that's already on the CEO's desk has been bought by the...
secretary in this case.
Secretary. Yeah. So there's
So the start is exactly the same.
I didn't know that's funny.
And the silent character is exactly the same. It's essentially a pair of hands. I think the downside, let's be honest with this, I've touched upon this already, the psychology doesn't make any bloody sense at all. It's purely for laughs, the whole thing.
But that's all right.
Yeah, it's a wind-up of circumstances each time, and they do fall in and out of love, it seems to me, very, very quickly with each other, which suggests an underlying passion. But, there's it feels almost episodic. You get the episode about the coffee, and then you get the episode about that she's about to pull off a sale, and then he ruins it, and then you get the episode where she asks for a rise and then gets fired, and then you get the episode where she fakes the tax people, and then she fakes the solicitor, and then she, it's not a seamless narrative. It feels like each chapter hits its natural comic conclusion a wall, and then it moves into the next one, and what you don't get is soft transitions and an emotional development. It's not a journey. As we would understand it as in a musical. But that's not the point. It's much more climbing a big flight of steps.
Though I think some kind of bookend between each would have been helpful, for me at least. I think, whether it was the way it was edited, but it felt like we were watching a continuous scene.
Mm.
So that might have helped, even if it were a fade out to black and then lights up again.
Yes, although we should say we were just watching a recording of a live performance. It wasn't being done for the recording. No. In a kind of, it didn't take any televisual grammar, did it?
Oh no, sure.
I think they had two cameras, so occasionally cut from one to the other, but that was about it. Overall feelings, because I remember afterwards you said something along the lines of it was a little difficult to understand in places, but great fun. But just in a thumbnail, how would you describe it?
Probably exactly like that. I really liked the music, and I think it was. I imagine it was some kind of pseudo-translation, but also rewriting in terms of the libretto.
Yeah, I doubt it had corporation tax mentioned in the original.
Well, sure. But I think that was tastefully done, and it didn't feel too unwed to the music. I thought it was neat.
Neat is a brilliant word, actually, because I agree with you, funnily enough. I think the transposing from a household environment to an office environment, this is a terrible thing to say and an indictment of modern society, but it's an environment where you can still sort of have a male person in charge in a position of authority and have women in lower positions who are doing all the work. It's a terrible thing to say, but it works. We immediately accept that as the environment which this story is going to tell us.
Yeah.
So neat is a beautiful way. It felt like a lot more thought went into it when you stop and think about it than you think you might have just had if you'd just gone and seen it once and gone, oh, that was fun.
For sure.
Was there anything musically interesting about it from your point of view?
Not hugely, but I think it was nice to have remnants of the Pergolesi score, and it wasn't so heavily doctored that it
was lost.
Yeah, but at the same time, if they wanted to adapt it in a way to fit the moment of the scene, they did. They added a beat, they added more instruments or whatever. It worked.
Would you have been able to tell it was derived from an 18th century piece if you'd seen it fresh, do you think? I know it's a difficult question.
Hard. I think I would have recognised the music, which would have got me musing about something, but I wouldn't have thought the story was so faithful to the original. In
its disguised form, as it were, yes. No, and that was a surprise to me. It wasn't until I researched it, but I had realised quite how it takes many of the beats and very neatly and deftly pops them into the new environment. It's interesting because Pergolesi is not vastly remembered, and if he is remembered, he's quite often remembered for this, because this is deemed to be... Well, I mean, in the history of musical theatre, we should never forget that the comic opera is certainly one of the parents, not just through Gilbert and Sullivan in the English tradition, but throughout. The Marriage of Figaro is a clear kind of same in the same wheelhouse as this, I would say.
Oh, absolutely.
With Mozart, and he's a little later, so Pergolesi comes first. You can't say he's the first who's developing the form, but he's an early practitioner, and the fact this is still being performed in some form is most impressive. But I didn't know this until recently, and this is purely online research I did for this conversation, but some of Pergolesi's music, not from this, but from other works he wrote, was included in the soundtrack of the film of Amadeus, which of course isn't about him at all. But it's obviously felt to be of a fit and for the period.
Sure. That's interesting.
Yes, I was surprised, because you might have thought they'd have used Mozart's music.
Well, yes. Maybe there were some copyright claims going on, who knows? The Mozart estate saying, no.
Surely Mozart's out of copyright. So that's the Secretary turned CEO, a sort of short and sweet wonder, really, in a way, would you say?
I would agree.
Yeah, sort of super lovely.
Yeah.
Musical talk.
Oh, you accuse me of everything, and Hi, I'm Danyal Dhondy. I'm from Lucid Arts and Music, and we've got a show called The Secretary Turned CEO, which is playing at the Fringe Festival this year.
Now, this is a very interesting piece to me because it is a light comic opera, a chamber opera, I suppose it might be best described, but it's not in what I would call the sort of British understanding of a comic opera, which is Gilbert and Sullivan, which is more an operetta, or a Savoy opera, a genre in its own right. It's much more in the European style of a light comic opera, isn't it? A sort of Marriage of Figaro and a Barbara Seville kind of thing. Would that be fair, or
yes.
am I talking nonsense? Tell me if I'm talking nonsense.
No, absolutely. I think they're two really good archetypes, actually. The piece we've actually based it on is by Pergolesi, a composer from the 18th century. His comic intermezzo, La Serva Padrona, was one of the earliest examples of comic opera to emerge in Italy. And what happened, you'd have a serious opera going on, and in the interval the curtain would come down and a small troupe of singers would come out in front of the curtain and perform an intermezzo for the audience while
You'd
they're
have a support act in the middle,
exactly.
essentially, to use.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and when I heard about this, I thought, that's a great idea, and actually translates weirdly well to the Fringe because it's the right length, it's the right sort of amount of performers, the right amount of, very little set or technical stuff to deal with.
Yes, it's a highly transportable show.
Exactly, yes.
It's a beautiful little gem. It really is.
Oh, thank you.
And you do it impeccably and beautifully. But let's talk a bit more about its genesis. So, how did you stumble across a musical with a pedigree like this? I use musical broadly, you understand?
That's absolutely fine, yeah. I moved in once with a bass singer called Dionysius Kiropoulos, who is now pursuing an academic career.
Very long calling card, I think.
Yes, absolutely. But at the time he was pursuing a singing career, and he showed me this piece, this Pergolesi, and said, "This is my favourite thing to sing. It's just right for my voice. Can we do it somewhere?" And I had a look at it and I thought, wow, this is a really great opera. It's got some fantastic arias in it. And actually, once I bothered to sit down with the translation and read the story, I thought it's very funny as well. It's got this kind of ridiculous farcical plot, and I thought
it's cheekily silly, isn't it? Really?
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. Lots of dressing up, lots of sort of disguises and tricks, and people being sort of unintentionally stupid
and squabbling.
Yes, of course. squabbling and bawdiness as well.
What's not to like, as I say?
Absolutely. I was quite surprised that this kind of thing existed so early, but then I read a bit more about it and I found out that it was sort of directly one of the direct inspirations for Mozart's comic operas that came a little later.
I mean, forgive me, just in the history of musical theatre, I know everything branches out, but you can trace everything back to these kind of light operas.
Yes.
I think you can.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I wouldn't know much about broader stuff, but that's a very interesting point. So we.
There's that and the ballad opera, which is a bit more British tradition, but that's a slightly different thing. But
okay.
They're all contemporaneous.
Right.
Thomas Arne and people like that.
Oh, Thomas Arne, yeah. So Dionysus and I set about workshopping it, and I'm a composer and arranger by trade, so I thought adding my bits and bobs to it, I'd try and do a new arrangement of it. And I looked at the score and I thought, actually what might work really well is to have a kind of modern jazz band based ensemble. Because, it's all written in figured bass, and actually that's a bass line and a chord instrument, really. So a double bass and a guitar works almost just as well as the original. I didn't really have to do much to put it on those instruments and actually give it this sort of fresher contemporary sound.
And in a way, forgive me, I think that's the right decision. Well, it's absolutely the right decision because you've come up trumps, but it's the right decision because actually putting it on as a period piece somehow disconnects it, or can disconnect it. You'd have to sort of almost be an expert in the period or have an interest in the period, whereas actually giving it a 21st century spin, English, resetting it in a context that people would understand, which is an office, business environment, and then just making sure that you're both true to the authenticity of the music as conceived, whilst at the same time performing it and augmenting it in a slightly more modern, contemporaneous way, is a really beautiful handle. It's very accessible. I found it very accessible, and there was a group in the audience, I thought, last night, which is when I saw it, who were enjoying it and appreciating it, and the comments afterwards were very positive as well. So.
Oh. Well, good. Yes, I heard a few of those. We've had some really nice audience feedback. But it's a really interesting point you raise about how authenticity can kind of be a little bit of an illusion sometimes, because if you try and do everything exactly as it was performed, then you're doing it in the wrong context, maybe.
Yeah, you're setting it in aspect.
Yeah. And the piece often comes across as a kind of museum piece when it's done nowadays, which is quite rarely. And I thought if we could somehow bring it back to how a contemporary audience might have seen it, and the kind of
so it meant something, as it were, to a modern day audience.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah, as I say, it's the accessibility, in fact, isn't it?
Yeah, so we've tried to adapt the piece in a variety of ways. So I did my arrangement, as I mentioned, and I also wrote some new interlinking bits of music between the recitatives, which kind of tick off a load of different stylistic influences from the modern day. I did that mostly because I think faffing around with old recitatives is not so advisable when trying to get translations.
It can be tiresome too.
Yeah.
And a modern ear isn't that much. Doesn't seem so keen on it.
Yeah. It didn't
just want dialogue or something to make it easy.
I think so.
Accessibility again, isn't
accessibility.
it? That ability to connect with something.
So anyway, then the next stage in the piece's genesis was that I met Becca Marriott, who is a soprano by trade, but also had a fantastic libretto in her, it seemed. She had also independently been working on the same piece.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
And Dionysus was the singer, was the mutual link. So he introduced us, and her version was this modern office-based translation of the story. And so we put our heads together and we put our ideas together and came up with this new piece, The Secretary Turned CEO.
How wonderful to find someone else with a similar idea. Or is it wonderful? I hope it's wonderful, because the fusion is really fantastic.
Well, it was, because I'm always hampered as a composer working in opera at being really totally unable to write words myself.
Oh, right. Well, but the fact you know that is really helpful, actually, because there are many people in the world who don't know that, and then you get a lumbering translation, not saying you would, but one can find these things.
No, totally.
So it's almost a perfect sort of professional marriage in a way.
Absolutely. It was so great to find someone who has got a real talent for words and also a passion for the project and really committed and dedicated as me to kind of making it as good as it can be.
So let's talk about your element to it, though, because I think the score is actually one of the things that really sticks out. I mean, there's lots of lovely elements in it, but I love the fact, well, let me be honest, I had clocked it as a show I was coming to see anyway, but I saw you performing with members of your band, orchestra, I don't know how you want to call them, outside the Pleasant Stone, funnily enough, which is where we are now, in the street, and I was waiting for somebody, and I'm pleased they were late, because I was really enjoying what was going on. It was just it's something very different from the Fringe, and yet absolutely within the Fringe tradition. So, but standing out is so difficult. But standing out in a way that's good and entertaining, and you think, this sounds fantastic. So I knew I was in for a good evening before I arrived. And I love that marriage between, well, sometimes you're sitting at your keyboard, being a bit more cool and vibey, and then sometimes you stand up and you play the violin like a virtuoso, as I'm sure you are, but like the devil. You are... It's Paganini revived, as it were, in terms of, but it looks really impressive. It really does, and all of your colleagues providing the music look very versatile. You look absolutely, you look like you're enjoying it too, which goes a long way. But I love how you have married old music and new music, to be for the phrase. I mean, did you find there was any jarring, or I'm sure you're deft enough to have avoided that in your head even before you put pen to paper? But
It's a hard question to answer. I'm so close to the music that I perhaps can't see elements which might be jarring and which other people might.
Well, I think you've avoided it, but it's interesting how you got to the point where it is all avoided.
I think maybe it's to do with the subject matter of the piece. It's such a farcical comedy, and in the stage action, there's a sense that anything can happen at any point. Situations can turn on their faces, characters' motivations can be revealed to be totally opposite to what you thought, and that kind of energy is being applied to the music as well. So at one moment it's a very beautiful kind of late Baroque aria, and then suddenly you go into a blues weird thing that tells a bit more of the story in the way that a recitative would, or there's a bit of reggae in there thrown in, and it's kind of incongruous, but in keeping with the mood of the piece, I think.
Well, let me put it this way. I actually thought it might be a modern pastiche, because I didn't know the original. But when I say pastiche, I mean in the best possible sense. I thought perhaps you'd composed the whole thing. But I mean that as a compliment, because what that means is, of course, that actually, although the styles are different, the fusion works really well. As an integrated whole, it has a beautiful, beautiful score.
Oh, thank you. Well, I did do certain things to try and give it a bit more integrity. I found a few little themes and chord progressions in the Pergolesi which I liked and which can kind of be played out of context as well. So
transferable, is it? Yeah.
Transferable, yeah. So, for instance, the first aria starts with a quite distinctive 3-bar phrase, which is the same motive going down in thirds. I could sing it if you like.
Yes, go on.
And it goes out. And anyway, that kind of comes back all the way through the piece in my bits that I've composed.
It's a leitmotif, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah. So, even though that's kind of the wrong century again, but never mind.
It's a bit Wagnerian, perhaps, but but in that sense, but it's as you say, it's something to which it comes back and helps generate cohesiveness. But there's energy as well, and you said so yourself. You wanted, you were looking to put energy into the piece. Now, obviously, it's a speedy little, it doesn't hang around.
No,
it knows what it wants to do. It comes in, it does it. Thank you very much. I'm on my way home, and the music matches that completely. Now, obviously, the original score would.
Yeah.
But it's a directorial point, but it's also a musical directorial point, isn't it, as well? Which is the hat you're wearing. So, how did you keep the energy up?
One thing actually we found quite difficult when we first arrived in Edinburgh was the space we're in. These kind of black box studio theatres, they're not really designed for unamplified music. And
no, they're not.
And we got there, and the big thick curtains on the wall soaking up a lot of the sound, and it's just a slightly different space than we're used to, and we all panicked a little and went, oh, this is much harder work than it was in our sort of wooden floored rehearsal room. So I think just over the course of the first couple of weeks in our performances, we've really just tried to think about how to get the energy back in, and part of that is just raising the speed slightly. Part of that is how I think just using more dynamic extremes in the band, and just kind of encouraging the singers to really go in the moment and not be shy and not wait for people and have a kind of sense that it all might fall apart because everyone's hurtling forward at full tilt. Somehow it stays together.
Yes, it's very much pell-mell, isn't it? It really is. And there's also a lovely little in-joke. There's a moment right at the beginning, I think it is, where someone picks up the telephone and is immediately put on hold, and therefore you go to a much more traditional piece of classical music, which we all recognise as being a typical piece of old music. So that's a lovely little interpolation, I suppose. Is
thank you.
Well. Did you choose the hold music on that?
It did. Well, we needed to get the guy's mobile phone ringtone in there. That was the dramatic conceit. So we're thinking, what could we do? Could we have him take a call from his friend or hang up? And we thought that might be quite funny, something that used the band. Anyway, and then the phone ringtone, without giving away too much of the plot, comes back in a kind of crucial context later.
Yes. Now, let's talk about the performances and indeed the look of the piece. It's actually quite simple in some senses. There are principally 2 singing roles and a third sort of reaction role, I think, would be who's the intern. So let's talk about it. There is the boss of a luxury lavatory roll company, I think is the best way of describing it, who have hopes to get a contract with the House of Lords, such is their prestige. And then you've got his incredibly able secretary, PA, who really runs the show, in fairness. He's a bit of a lazy old so-and-so. There's the love-hate relationship they have, which is the cause of much bickering and squabbling and you're in, you're out. It's a lovely moment. I mean, where after a little argument, she writes his resignation letter for him in a way, or rather she sacks him, or certainly tries to.
Yes.
But you've also got this intern who doesn't really sing, but he does a lot of reaction. He's brought in to act as a policeman or play a role. So it's an interestingly petite cast, done in bold colours, because actually, and I mean that literally, there are filing boxes which have got different coloured sides in big bold colours, green and blues and yellows and reds. Somehow, Lord knows how you've done it, you've acquired scarlet lavatory roll. There are 3 rolls of red loo paper, basically, which...
That was one of our designer's most difficult tasks, to find coloured loo roll, because it doesn't really exist anymore.
No.
You go to the supermarkets and there's white, there's maybe peach, but getting bright coloured stuff is... I don't know how she did it. She must have found it online, I think.
You're saying the market's fallen out of the bottom? Hey!
Very good, very good.
I feel my work here is done. But it looks striking. My word, it was fantastic. Yes, because there's other loo rolls as well. But, the primary colours really help underscore the pitch at which the performances are going, and the company CEO, the boss, is in this beautiful, actual sort of purple plum suit, really.
Yes.
It's amazing.
That was another internet wonder. Our first idea was, make this look like it's in an office, because, we're being quite naturalistic. We want to kind of go with that. And then we thought, well, actually, it's going to look a bit glum and boring and grey, and we've got to get some colour in there.
I must say, yes.
So we, inspired by these modern kooky offices like Innocent Smoothies or Google, where there's like splashes of colour everywhere, we thought, we can just take that to an extreme and make it quite surreally primary colours, bold. I think that was a decision from our director and librettist and designer together, and I think it's come off really well. It really complements the mood and the feel of the piece.
Yes, it sets a tone in a way, doesn't it? It really does. And the performances are very up-tempo, and as you say, they also turn on the sixpence. I mean, if people are looking for naturalistic psychology here, I don't think they're going to find that.
Yes.
But that's not what you come for this for, I think. I think you come for a jolly little treat. I don't want to undersell it by saying that, because actually it's a very accomplished piece. I think everyone in it is... your singers are fantastic too.
They are. We're very lucky to have them, especially on, fringe salaries, as it were.
Yes,
but they've got a range of kind of experience. Some of them have been just come out of postgrad in London colleges. Some of them have been on the professional scene for a while, and they all sort of saw the piece and thought it was a really good role and worth doing, even if it's a month of essentially unpaid work.
But sometimes when a job is enjoyable, and it was enjoyable to me as a member of the audience, so I hope it was enjoyable to them. But here's a question though. I mean, if they are both, the 2 I saw are both professional opera singers, and the score is both true to its original roots and yet also modern and contemporaneous and has twists. Were they sufficiently aware of the original piece for that to be not off-putting, but for it to be a new version which they had to then was a challenge to them to absorb, or did they come to it sufficiently fresh that actually the score was sufficiently integrated they could
Actually, they had a bit of pre-warning. We have workshopped the piece before, and a video of that existed. So the production's changed a lot since then. The whole cast and the directors also changed, but they were able to sort of see the piece and get a sense of what it was before they committed and realised that they were doing something that totally wasn't what they'd expected, a Pergolesi Baroque opera or whatever.
Yes, I suppose on paper it's a rather different prospect to actually what you get.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's a much, if I may say, as a paying audience, it's a much better prospect in some senses. You know, I go to musical theatre more, but I have a soft spot for comic opera and operetta and indeed the Gilbert and Sullivan tradition, very much so. The more British tradition, I suppose.
Yeah.
But this landed in my lap in a completely digestible form. And it was sweet to taste, if I can follow this, take it further. But I was impressed. There were moments where they were singing what appeared to be their libretto against, and I say against, you know, they were singing what felt like the original music without us hearing the original music, but with your new overlay upon it, which worked perfectly. There was a kind of there was a dichotomy in what we were getting musically and what we were getting lyrically, or so it seemed, but in a way that was balanced and appropriate. Is that something that you recognise, or have I misunderstood something?
I think that's a very fair and generous summation. Absolutely, yeah.
No, I like the fact that it could do things which, as a lay listener, someone fresh to it, I could see that. Also, what it appeared to me was that I was hearing the invisible melody, for want of a better phrase, whilst hearing the reality of the wider music around it. I haven't described that at all well, I don't think. But
I think it's
a quality I'm trying to describe.
I think I get a sense of what you mean, actually. And taking something up to Edinburgh, taking an opera up to Edinburgh is always terribly risky. It's not the most popular of genres. You know, you're up against all sorts of things. And so one of our ideas has been, what we'd love to do is to kind of bring a new audience in who maybe haven't heard opera before, haven't been to opera, and through this kind of very accessible surface, actually kind of expose them to the beautiful music that's there underneath, and maybe get them thinking, oh, this is actually something different than what I expected.
Opera is no longer a closed book to me because I've seen and enjoyed this. So
yes, that kind of thing would be lovely if we've managed to do that to anyone on the Fringe.
Well, what I think you've successfully done, and in a really splendid, ingenious and impeccably produced and performed way, is resurrect something that's both important and actually jolly in its own right, even if it wasn't important. I think it's a lovely little piece. And I think, as I say, the word I keep coming back to is accessibility.
Yes.
But accessibility is not enough, because accessibility merely means you can absorb it. It doesn't necessarily mean you like it. It's accessible and enjoyable, and that is a very winning combination, it seems to me. Now we've been talking about this musical, and we've been talking about the band, and we've been talking about the singers and the performers. But let's put some sort of, I was going to say names to faces, but let's put names to images, because there are no faces here.
Sure.
Who's in your band with you? Because you form a very beautiful little sort of group together. Did you know them previously?
Actually, our double bass player I did meet last year in Malta. We played a gig in the Malta Symphony Orchestra together, and from some such things, great things born.
Well, it's all about networking, isn't it?
Absolutely. He's called Ben Havington Williams, and what's great about him, he's got this jazz background, but is now a kind of very dedicated and serious classical player, so he's just got both strings to his bow, as it were.
Hey, I like it.
And
that helps perfectly with this, doesn't it? Because the show is the fusion of that. So you've got the man for the job.
That foundation was just what we're looking for. And Nicholas Rogers, our guitarist, is really one of the most phenomenal players I've ever come across. He's just able to sight read stuff which most guitarists can't do, and if you can meet someone who can do it, they're often not a fantastic guitarist, and he's both. We're also our singer's a double cast, because it's quite, as you know, quite tricky to rely on just a single person for the role up here.
And so also Edinburgh Fringe flu.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've got in total 4 fantastic singers in our company. There's Crispin Lewis and Joanne Watson were the cast that you saw last night, who did a fantastic performance. And our other cast who are performing tonight are Sophia Troncoso and Tristan Harcom.
I'm actually glad you asked. You mentioned that. It's something I had wondered whether you were relying on just the 2. So I think you're very sensible. Also, forgive me, opera is a complex form and a strenuous form on the voice as well, isn't it? So, I mean, presumably it's also helpful to them to be able to have a night off where they can just sit there sipping honey drinks.
Well, even though it's a short show, it's just the energy and the kind of wild schedule of the Fringe is not great for singing every night. And as you've seen, we've been doing flyering things outside, so we can sort of alternate and have the singers who aren't on that evening doing that sort of thing.
The problem with having to keep up pep is it can make you go pop, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of health, that's absolutely true. Well, each and every one of those people is brilliant.
Yeah.
As are you,
thank
Daniel,
you.
by the way.
Also must mention Jordan Eliach, our actor, who really came in at absolutely the last minute. What happened? We had another guy called Tom Lawson who broke his foot.
Oh no!
2 days before our dress rehearsal in London, which was
bad for him and bad for you. Yes.
Can you imagine? A total nightmare. But somehow Tom called his good friend Jordan up and said, "Do you fancy doing this instead?" And Jordan's got a strong musical theatre background, and he thought, "Yeah, fine. I'll just take a month off, go to Edinburgh, do a show." And he came in and he was just fantastic from the word go. And
yes, he's got those reaction skills which are exactly what are needed for this.
And yes, absolutely, sort of interfacing with the audience a bit more. So
you've mentioned it's already had a sort of performance and productions before. What is the hope for the future?
Well, I'd love to take it to more venues. This is the first time it's had a proper full length run. If it could maybe find a theatre in London which would be willing to put it on, or touring the rest of the UK, or maybe even further afield, maybe even take it back to Italy, see what they make of it.
See if anyone remembers it from the first time.
Yes.
And but as you said earlier, it's a very transportable show. You can pack it up in a trunk and carry it away.
Yes,
the biggest thing is really a CEO's chair and a double bass.
Yeah, the double bass, we couldn't fit that on the train. That was the main worry coming up, so we did have to hire a van. But yeah, it's pretty transportable.
Yes, it seems to be a good prospect if someone's interested in that.
Yeah, and no technical requirements really. We can kind of bring a laptop and a speaker and do all of that. So yeah.
Well, that's right. It's integrated within the orchestra and the band, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful show. So, do you have a website? And what's the name of the company again?
The company's called Lucid Arts, and our website is www.lucidarts.org.uk, and all the information about the show's there.
And how long are you here in Edinburgh for?
We are here till the 31st of August.
Oh, right to the end?
Right to the end, yeah. We're performing at 7:20 every day at C Venues on Chambers Street. It's venue 34.
It is indeed. It's actually one of my favourite venues, funny enough, because it's a lovely grand building.
It is.
Even if you can't see any of the walls because of the black material, as you say.
Funnily enough, I've been to Edinburgh twice before, and I think the first time was just to see a friend who was in a musical about Tony Blair.
Which one?
A student production. It was called Tony the Blair Musical.
Because the same year there was Tony Blair the musical.
There was.
That was James Lark.
That was James Lark, who I knew from Cambridge, but this was a York production.
Was?
Anyway.
Yes, and I remember it had Princess Diana in it.
Oh right, yes.
As appearing in a kind of sort of phantom role, because I saw them both.
Okay.
And funnily enough, there was a third Tony Blair musical in London at the same time, so it was obviously a
It's been the year of Tony.
Well, I saw Tony the Blair musical.
Yes.
Oh right, so who knows? We may have been sitting in the same audience.
Quite possibly.
And you know James as well.
I do, yeah.
Marvellous.
Yeah.
He's a very talented man. His
Yes.
Snow Spider was recently. That's a very good show.
Right. I haven't come across him recently actually, but I remember him being very, very talented at university, and
Well, he hasn't lost his century, please no. But you're not exactly a deficit in this area. No, this show is fantastic. Do you have any further projects that you're pursuing, or you'd like? What's your ambition? Are you going to be raiding the chest of other delights which have been laying dormant for too many years?
I've been looking actually. It's funny you mentioned Thomas Arne. I was looking at a couple of his works as well earlier. That would maybe be a nice compliment to try something English to go with the Italian. It'd be nice to find a partner piece for the Pergolesi as well, because it's such a short length that it might be a problem scheduling it on its own, but maybe in a double bill it could
with
work.
two different.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe finding something for similar instrument possibilities would be a good next thing to do.
Well, I look forward to perhaps seeing you on the Fringe next year with your Thomas Arne spectacular.
We'll see, maybe.
Well, thank you, Daniel, so much for talking to Musical Talk. This show is lovely. It's a 5-star show, absolutely. It's impeccable, it's amusing, it's entertaining, it's accessible. It's everything that actually the Fringe should be delivering. So thank you very much for bringing it here. And I hope it goes on to have a great history in the future. It's already got to have a great history, so let's hope that you're pushing it into the next century and beyond, perhaps.
Well, thank you so much. It's been lovely talking to you.
I'm nothing without you. Serena, you're a part of me. You are a very heart of me, such a part of me, oh, the heart of me. Oh, poor defenseless creature, what will become of you? What will become of you? It is so gibberish to me, it is so gibberish to me, it is so gibberish to me. All these numbers, all these tables. Serena, I just don't know, I'm a coward. A coward, I have no bones, no bones.
Well, there we are, the Secretary turned CEO. And you've just heard in reverse order Danyal Dhondy, who is the musical director behind the show when I saw it at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2015. And before that, Colm Malloy, who was talking about watching the video of that performance, actually recorded in 2013, and which you can see online. If you'd like to watch The Secretary Turned CEO, you can. You need to go to the website known as Vimeo, rather than YouTube, and there you can either search for 11_08_13_ The Secretary Turned CEO, which is how it's labelled, or you can go to vimeo.com/7274758. And if that still isn't enough to tempt you, here's the original blurb from the 2015 Edinburgh Festival Fringe catalogue. Sexual tension, gross incompetence and barely concealed chaos lurk just beneath the surface in this hilarious take on Pergolesi's comic intermezzo La Serva Padrona. The Baroque meets blues, with a new English libretto that creates a farcical storyline that's worryingly lifelike. And to prove that farce lies everywhere in real life, my apologies now for making the error in that conversation with Colm at the beginning of the episode where I suggested that The Barber of Seville was written by Mozart. I meant, of course, The Marriage of Figaro. For some reason, I often muddle those two together, because they are cut, I think, from a similar cloth. So that's a hair shirt for me. And a hair shirt being cut from a similar cloth is a haircut, which takes us back to The Barber of Seville. Anyway. And as I said at the beginning of this episode, it's so lovely to hear that light opera can still have something to say in the 21st century, and is still an important part of musical theatre's history, both going into the future and of course significantly in the past. Well, that's it for this week, I think, but join us again here on Musical Talk next week, where we're going to be looking at two shows which parallel this week's episode, but with totally different approaches. One is an adaptation of Jane Austen's Persuasion, and one is an absolutely brand spanking new 3-person opera called Drive-By Shooting. And with a title like that, it couldn't be anything other than absolutely up to the minute. So, do join me again for that. But until then, why not go off and enjoy a week of not listening to me? And really, there is no answer to that, except that's a good idea. I'm going to do exactly that. And to help you on your way, let me close this episode with the traditional one-word ending. That word is not banana, it is goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited by Thos Ribbits and presented by Thos Ribbits and Colm Malloy. Copyright Musical Talk 2020, except for the songs where the copyright remains with the original creators. And my enormous thanks go to Danyal Dhondy for allowing me to play some of his music in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. That was about right, wasn't it? How long do you think that was?
20.
18. So that's exactly on the button, I think.